I have about 19 minutes so far from that point, so it's probably been about 20 minutes total.
Doing good. Doing good.
Okay. Yeah, we're fine.
Keep going. All right. So up next is Dr. Wayne Woldt. He's going to give us a FAA update, specifically on the educational interpretation memo that they just recently put out. So, Dr. Wayne, please join us and talk to us about that new interpretation.
Okay, and thank you, Victor. Yes, we are going to be shifting gears a little bit here.
I should have done your whole introduction in here, but let
me
read off your introduction before I just because we've got plenty of time. So
make it a short version.
A short version. Oh, let's see. Dr. Wayne Woldt is an associate professor of environmental and water resources engineering with a joint appointment in the Department of Biological Systems Engineering and the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and the UAS in Agriculture Learning Network project lead. Dr. Woldt has developed a research and extension program on the application of unmanned aircraft systems in agriculture and natural resources at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Specific areas of research and education include deployment and flight operations of unmanned aircraft systems, performance characterization of autonomous navigation systems, sensor system development, sensor integration, and information management. He has a private pilot certificate and has been conducting flight operations for 3 years within the context of the FAA issued certificates of authorization, also known as COAs. In addition, he has developed and delivered numerous extension educational programs on unmanned aircraft in agriculture. So welcome, Dr. Wayne.
Well, thank you, Victor. And yes, we are going to shift gears a little bit here from what was a very interesting, technically oriented presentation, where a lot of nuts and bolts and interesting technologies and uses for these unmanned aircraft systems was described and presented. And we're going to shift into now what is generated a lot of news and buzz in the world of unmanned aircraft, and that's a recently released educational interpretation for the flight of unmanned aircraft. So I'll take this topic and run with it here. Just a little bit more information about myself here at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. What I'd like to do is first review the FAA view or perspective on commercial flight. And the reason I'm doing this is because it helps to set the context for this new interpretation that they've just released. And as we go through this, I hope you'll start to see the connections. And this review, it'll be a very brief review, is for both piloted aircraft as well as unmanned aircraft, because there are also some parallels there. Then I'll provide a brief overview of the new interpretation that was just released May 4th, 2016. And 5.5 pages in length. I'll be just hitting some of the high points on it. Then some initial perceptions and thoughts about moving forward with this interpretation. And then hopefully we'll get some questions and dialogue going on this, because my reading of it is that there's a lot of details here that are yet to be worked out. And I hope that as we go through this, you'll think of some questions and we'll put them out there and we'll get a good discussion going about this new interpretation. So first off then, as I mentioned, I'd like to just briefly review the FAA, the way that the FAA deals with commercial flight. Let me just put it that way. There's a long history, a long tradition of the FAA and their interpretation of flight for commercial purposes. And we need to think about that, because that is front and center on their interpretation for educational purposes. So the FAA has defined commercial flight in the context of an individual that's acting as pilot in command, which is always the person that has the final responsibility for any flight, of an aircraft for compensation or hire. So now we see that money is entering into the discussion. In other words, this is beyond recreational flight, to go out and fly for fun, for enjoyment. It's now for a specific kind of purpose where money is playing a role, or some other type of compensation. And I'll talk more about that. And there are many pages of federal aviation regulations that are dealing with flight and legal flight of aircraft in our national airspace system. And commercial flight is no exception to that. There's a tremendous volume of information out there. Given the timeline here and the purpose of this, we can only touch on just the very near surface of that. But at a minimum, requirements would be an FAA-issued commercial pilot certificate. And this is different than a private pilot certificate. It's an additional level of knowledge and awareness and examination that would go into achieving a commercial pilot certificate. And the individual would need to be qualified to fly under a set of regulations that are called 14 CFR, that's the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 61. The individual would also need a Class 2 medical. There's 3 levels of medicals: a Class 3 medical, which would be for private pilots, Class 2 medical for commercial pilots, and then a Class 1 medical, which would be for airline transport pilots. So your typical, passenger flying jet of the major airlines. That would be a Class 1 medical for those pilots. So commercial is somewhere in between the Class 3 and Class 1, defined as Class 2. And then there's another element to this also beyond just the pilot qualifications, and that is the aircraft themselves. The aircraft would need to be certified under 14 CFR Part 119, as well as the aircraft operations. It ties mainly to the operations and how the aircraft are maintained, and it's a 2-part piece here. So it's not only the pilot, but also the aircraft that needs to be given some consideration for commercial flight. Now, private pilots may not, and this is a general rule, act as pilot in command of an aircraft that is carrying passengers or property for compensation or hire. Okay, so right away the FAA is saying, if you're a private pilot, you can't do this. And they add on another segment to that statement that says, nor for compensation or hire may they act as pilot in command of an aircraft. Now, I underline that because unmanned aircraft are viewed as aircraft by the FAA. So this even, covers beyond, let's say, carrying passengers. Basically, they say that you cannot operate as pilot in command of an aircraft for compensation or hire. So there are a few exceptions to this. One is the kind of sharing of expenses, and this is a little bit of a opportunity for private pilots to recover some of the cost of flying with a friend or a colleague or something along that line, where a private pilot may not pay less than the pro rata share of the operating expenses of a flight with passengers. And this tends to involve fuel costs, oil costs, any sort of airport costs that might be associated with the flying, or rental fees. So if I'm flying as a private pilot with one other individual, then essentially this is saying I can split the cost of flying that flight with the individual that's riding with me at 50-50 ratio. And I can get back half the cost of fuel, oil. Airport cost might be, for example, a tie down. If I need a tie down, the tie down fee or rental fees. So it's very strict in terms of, what the flow of the money that's taking place between a pilot and a passenger, for example. Now, I mentioned commercial flight operations themselves, and that a Part 119 certificate is required to operate civil aircraft as a commercial operator. Now, basically, a Part 119 certificate has to comply with more stringent rules than those of what are called Part 91 flight operations, which is basically recreation. Part 119 also draws in other parts of the Code of Federal Regulations 121, 125, and 135. And essentially, what this is doing is it's saying that commercial flight is, I say, upping the ante in terms of responsibility and safety as compared to private flight. So it makes sense. If you're a customer and you're buying a ticket to get from point A to point B, you're putting your money on the line, you're buying it, you expect that the services provided are going to be responsible and safe, and that you will arrive at your destination in a safe and sound manner. That's the whole idea. Once the money's on the line, everything becomes much more intense. For example, aircraft will be inspected more frequently under a commercial flight operation. They have what's called a 100-hour flight inspection period rather than an annual flight inspection. So if an aircraft, for example, is seeing a use that is generating, let's say, 100 hours of flight every 3 months, then it's going to need to be inspected much more frequently than a private aircraft flown for private purposes, which is once a year, irregardless of the hours. Although, of course, it's recommended that if you fly a lot, you do get your aircraft inspected more frequently, but the rules don't require it. So now we get to this question of compensation or hire. And the FAA has been around the block on this. I like to say they've seen every trick in the book to try to get around this compensation or hire. Hey, I will tell you what, I'll fly you to Oklahoma City, and if a new couch shows up on my porch, I won't know what happened. That doesn't fly, so to speak. That is a commercial flight operation in that case. So the litmus test that the FAA uses is whether the carriage by air is merely incidental to the other person's business or is in itself an enterprise for profit. And I want to point this out because this plays directly into the educational interpretation that we'll be visiting about for unmanned aircraft. So another kind of explanation of this compensation or hire has been described by the FAA, where they give 4 criteria. Essentially, if the flight is a holding out of a willingness to, so there's a willingness there, transport persons or property. With an unmanned aircraft, it could be sensors, for example, is a property. Obviously, we're not talking about people in this case. From place to place, so we have a location to location flight going on for compensation or hire. That would then be deemed to be a commercial flight. And then another expression of compensation is that it includes the act of making up for whatever has been suffered or lost through another, and the act of remuneration. So this can be a quid pro quo, would be viewed as a commercial flight. In the unmanned aircraft world, I've heard of arrangements where the expression is, okay, I will fly your field for free, and if you purchase my services afterwards, that would be great. That's going to be a commercial type of interpretation, because the question always comes down to, would you go out and fly that field for free on your own time as a recreation or a hobby? And then there's the exchange of goods and services, even if at a later time that exchange takes place in some form or fashion. It's a commercial operation. So it's very essentially well defined through years of FAA interpretation. And it's for a private pilot, it's very important not to get wrapped into any sort of commercial kind of expectation, because you're beyond your certificate. Okay, so I think you see the point here. This is all about being paid to fly. Now let's shift to the unmanned aircraft, and we know that the FAA has, in fact, defined unmanned aircraft as aircraft. So now unmanned aircraft fall within the Federal Aviation Regulations. And we know from past webinars there's 3 ways to legally fly unmanned aircraft in national airspace. The public aircraft statutes, which involve a certificate of authorization available to public agencies, and a lot of universities, for example, fly under public aircraft statutes. There's the hobby and recreational, and then there's the Section 333 exemptions, which are a avenue for commercial operations, and we know that in general the FAA will require a private pilot certificate to fly under Section 333 exemptions. So I'd like to draw out here on this particular slide the point here that we've got hobby and recreational, and I kind of think of that like the private pilot in the unmanned aircraft world, and Section 333 exemptions, which are kind of the commercial perspective in the unmanned aircraft world. So with that background and with that awareness, I think it's clear that there's an awareness that educational use of unmanned aircraft systems represents a great opportunity. It's a great way to learn about technical aspects of unmanned aircraft systems. We all are aware of science, technology, engineering, math, or STEM types of programming, and I know Victor is really advocating unmanned aircraft as a part of STEM education. And we'll be presenting on that in our next webinar, in fact, for those of you that are interested. Hopefully you all are, because it's a great opportunity and a very much an emerging, growing area of unmanned aircraft. So STEM education, very important for our human resources and developing our human resources here in the United States. So the way I look at this is that FAA has developed this interpretation to thread a very fine needle between hobby and commercial unmanned aircraft system flight operations. And I believe that's why there's 5.5 pages in this interpretation, because there's a lot of nuances and important items to keep track of. So essentially what this interpretation is saying is that a person may operate under hobby or recreation rules, which are really, I guess, more guidelines based on the Advisory Circular 9157A, which we all likely are aware that the Academy of Model Aeronautics has adopted in their safety code. So a person can operate under hobby or recreational rules at educational institutions and community-sponsored events. So here, educational institutions would be, I guess, formal kinds of educational settings. Although I think there's some yet to be determined on this in terms of details. And then community-sponsored events are maybe a Boy Scout kind of event or a Girl Scout type event, a community group that has come together and wants an unmanned aircraft component in one of their events. An individual can do this and operate under these rules, provided that the person is not compensated. Okay, there we are back to the commercial definition. So it can't be compensated, or any compensation received is neither directly nor incidentally related to that person's operation of the aircraft at such events. So the compensation cannot be given for their operation of the aircraft. Okay? It has to be for other reasons. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So a little more detail here. A student at an educational institution can conduct model aircraft operations in accordance with the hobby recreational guidance in furtherance of his or her aviation-related education at that accredited institution. So a student, yeah, you can go out and fly under the hobby recreational guidance as part of an aviation education. Great. How about faculty? So in this case, the line gets a little thinner. Faculty teaching aviation-related courses at institutions may assist students who are operating a model aircraft under the hobby guidance, provided the student maintains operational control of the aircraft such that faculty members' manipulation of the controls is incidental and secondary to the students. So this is an interesting point here. And the idea is that as a faculty, that individual is being paid. They're being compensated, right, by the institution for their involvement in flight, for example, or in the aviation course. So since they're being compensated, if they're actively flying, essentially they're crossing this line into commercial flight operations. And that's where the FAA is trying to thread this needle to say the students flying and the faculty can manipulate the controls if it's incidental and secondary to the students. Maybe the student needs some help, for example. So this is interesting. I'm curious how this is going to play out. It is new. It's just released early May, and I think we'll see how this evolves with time. But this makes for some interesting challenges. So an initial perception here that aircraft flight under this interpretation needs to be for purposes other than what I put in quotes, flight for the sake of flight. So for example, if a particular course is learn how to fly unmanned aircraft, take this course for your training on flight of unmanned aircraft, that would not be allowed. That is would be a commercial flight operation and not really appropriate under this educational exemption. However, if the flight is for purposes other than the sake of flight, for example, the flight is to place sensors over an agricultural field, or to place sensors for infrastructure purposes like inspecting bridges, or maybe flying for film, TV, or photography courses where the purpose is to gather that imagery or information or data, then that would be allowed under this educational interpretation. In other words, the flying must be tangential and not a central part of the unmanned aircraft educational experience. It's a necessary part, but it's not the main focus. Then it would qualify under the educational use of unmanned aircraft systems. So I'm not, I hope that this has been helpful. We looked back at commercial flight, and the FAA is faced or fixed with all of their years of interpretation of commercial flight operations, and the fact that unmanned aircraft are defined as aircraft. And so with that basis and that background,